whatever's in your mind when you think of a test, the MCAT is like an order of magnitude more work and is harder than that.
Alex, welcome to the MCAT podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
I am doing great. How are you?
I am wonderful. So right off the bat, the first thing people are going to hear is like, wait a minute, that is not an American accent. Only Americans take the MCAT, right?
How dare you? I am born and raised in Boise, Idaho.
What's going on? Where's that fun accent from?
Yeah, so I am English. My parents are English. I immigrated to the US from the UK when I was 8 or 9 years old. And so I went to middle school in the US in New Jersey. I usually wait until kind of the second or third meeting to tell people that. Sorry, people from New Jersey. So I went to I did my undergraduate and graduate degree in the UK, but I kind of decided fairly early on in college that actually, I wanted to be a doctor in the US.
Yeah.
So it kind of hence started my MCAT journey, which was, I think, unconventional, but a lot of fun. And I think is, kind of in line with that, has equipped me really well to teach all of these concepts to people because, I had to teach them all to myself.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that because it's not often that I get to talk to someone who is an MCAT expert who went to college abroad, who lived in another country, from another country, and obviously you spent some time here as well. The educational system in the UK in terms of undergraduate, graduate work, how does that prepare a student for the MCAT, or does it not, and you have to go and do all of your own work outside of that?
Yeah, so I think if the best way to put it is if the American education system is, like a vast and shallow sea, you can imagine the British educational system as being, like an ocean trench, where is incredibly so. Obviously we don't have majors in the UK, so you kind of go into a degree program, which I guess is the closest equivalent to a major. So in terms of how it prepares you for the MCAT, I think that was kind of best summed up by my initial diagnostic test when I first started studying for the MCAT, where it's like I got like a 121 on Chem Phys, like whatever, a 124, 125 on Cars, a 132 on Biochem, and then like a 121 on Psych Soc. And that was a very natural reflection of the fact that I had been doing all of this, like experimental design in biochem, quite intensely for several years, but my education had basically never touched any other aspect, no physics, no chem, no orgo, no psych, no soc.
Yeah.
So, it was incredibly narrow and targeted, but kind of lacked the breadth that the MCAT really requires.
Yeah. So your training in undergrad would potentially be very similar to a non-traditional student here in the States who majored in finance and is like, I don't understand any of these core sciences. This is not something that I understand or learned in school. And so even though you're from a completely different educational system, it's very similar to that here in the States. And so we have lots of non-treds who listen to the podcast. How did you take those first steps into going, well, I didn't learn this in university, right? That you call it university, but I need to learn it, period. Where did you start with that journey to understanding the knowledge?
Yeah, so it was quite the journey, because I think as ever, if you come from an international background, and I'm sure exactly the same thing happens for, I majored in finance and then I've worked for an investment bank for 3 years. There's always this step kind of almost before you address any of the content, which is like, what the MCAT even is.
Yeah.
And actually, it was your podcast that really helped me with that, which is not just these are the concepts you need to learn, but there's always that moment where it's like, and the MCAT isn't like a normal test. Like whatever is in your mind when you think of a test, the MCAT is like an order of magnitude more work and is harder than that.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've come full circle.
You have to appreciate the scale before you start digging into the material itself.
Yes. So you've come full circle from podcast listener to now being a co-host on the MCAT podcast.
Oh, exactly. You know, this has a particular poetry to it that I like very much.
I love it. So the first steps, obviously listening to the podcast is great, but that doesn't teach you the core foundational sciences that you need. For someone who is in the UK, how do you take Postbac classes to understand that? Or did you come to the States and be like, okay, now I need to do this?
So I actually, I taught myself almost all of the material. I did take Postbac classes, but it was later. So I had taken some AP classes in high school, which had been really helpful. I took AP chemistry, which, you know, provided, if not enough depth of content for the MCAT, certainly like some background of like, what is molarity? What is a chemical equation? Yeah. And then, it just took me a very long time. You know, I got review books from test prep companies. I would review the concepts by myself. And, you know, I think it's very similar to, you know, perhaps someone who's trying to take the MCAT before they've taken Orgo or before they've taken, you know, chemistry, where just loading that much information into your brain before you even address any of the kind of MCAT specific strategy just takes a long time.
Wow. And so probably not a 3-month study plan.
No, it certainly was not. I reckon it took an entire summer, which I thought would be fine. I guess I'm lucky in the sense that I'm very good at, I'm someone who learns very well at just kind of sitting by myself and reading. Like I'm someone who's very suited to like self-learning. So that really helped. But yeah, so I reckon I devoted an entire summer to it, realized, you know, probably 2/3 into the prep process that it wasn't going to be enough, that, you know, I was still too weak on those foundational concepts. I didn't know enough psych-soc, I didn't know enough physics yet. And then I ended up taking all of the kind of subsequent winter break as well, which in the UK is quite long. It's about 6 weeks, to basically throw my entire life into the MCAT. Because at that point, you know, I'd taken enough practice tests. I felt like I had a good handle on the test-taking strategy components of the MCAT, and just had to just devote myself to like, okay, you need to know theories of personality. Like, it's just, they're nuggets of information and they have to go into your brain. Like, this is what you're doing for the next 6 weeks.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of those strategies. So obviously you were smart enough to understand the material, to teach it to yourself. And there are students out there who understand the material, have taught it to themselves, or who have taken classes and really understand the material, got great grades in school. But then it comes to the MCAT, and they don't have the strategies to do well on the MCAT. What are the biggest strategies you think students are missing when it comes to the MCAT?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because I think this particular concept often gets so tied up in people's kind of internal conceptions of their intelligence. Or actually, I feel like it's actually really a very different skill. You know, I often say to students who come to me and they're like, you know, I got great grades. I got an A in biology, or, you know, particularly if they're a couple of years out of college, they're like, I have a biology degree. Like, why am I not breaking the 50th percentile on biochem? And it's because the MCAT relies on a different set of skills that, you know, I think are related to, but ultimately separate from intelligence. You know, many people, I think, approach their undergrad learning experience kind of holding concepts in their brain and then kind of, for lack of a better word, regurgitating it on the exams. Yeah. You know, they have the mental equivalent of a stack of index cards that all have information on them. And ultimately, the MCAT is a content test, but it's not enormously interested in your ability to just kind of quote concepts.
Yep.
I remember on my MCAT exam, or I believe it's one of the full lengths, one of the questions I saw was, in a world where the quantum number for spin could hold 3 instead of 2 discrete values, how many elements would the second row of the periodic table be able to hold? And I loved that question, but it gets to the absolute core of that concept, which is if you just have the little pyramid memorized, like what's the electron configuration rules, you won't be able to answer that question. You have to understand the underlying concepts that those numbers refer to and how they would change if you manipulated them. That's a very different skill, but is still one that you can improve with practice.
Yeah, it's so important. I think too many students try to just brute strength their way through the MCAT and cram as much information in their head as possible. And then they go, okay, I got it all. Right, which is what you do for your final exams in college, but you can't do on the MCAT. Yeah. This is not the same. And then they go, what happened? So obviously you did well in the MCAT. You are now a Blueprint MCAT live online instructor. And for someone who's self-taught a lot of the material, that's amazing. And you're interacting with students now all the time who are struggling with the MCAT, or maybe not struggling, but learning how to take the MCAT. For someone just starting out on this journey, what is the kind of the first steps in terms of recommendations that you have to say, okay, let's dip your toes in this MCAT world?
Yeah. Always, I always recommend that people kind of, take a diagnostic test. It doesn't matter like what your approximate level, it doesn't matter where you think you are. It doesn't matter, like, in a sense, every full length or every diagnostic that you take is taking a snapshot of your like instantaneous MCAT ability at this point in time. And that's why I always feel like taking a diagnostic test feels like, dipping that pH stick into the liquid and seeing what it shows you. So I'm really mixing the metaphors here, but it's useful because taking a diagnostic test isn't just a measure of your like how well do you like know the underlying content. It also leans on your strategy. So particularly with like the analytics that Blueprint provides, it's so helpful because you can just instantly say to someone like, oh, you're much stronger in biochem than you are in physics. Or what you see with a lot of non-traditional applicants is they're very strong in cars because they've spent all day reading, but they have but they lack background in the sciences. And that's just so incredibly actionable for how do I structure my studying going forward.
Yeah. Oh, in terms of length of prep, that's always the most common question I seem to get. How long do I need to study for the MCAT? Obviously, for someone like yourself who is trying to learn all of the concepts and to learn MCAT strategy, potentially is different than someone just trying to learn the MCAT. Where do you think students should start that process to figure out how long they should be studying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the really informative figures are the ones published by the people who make the test, the ones published by the AAMC, which is, they report average amount of study time by every student who takes the test, which is not to say that every student should be studying the average. Of course, that's definitionally not true. But I think always provides like a really incredible like calibration point, particularly for people who are just coming to the MCAT like as a concept for the first time. And the AMC says that the average is about 290 hours for people who take the MCAT, walking in on test day. But we know, however, that the average MCAT score is about 500. And I'm sure as many people who are listening to this podcast know that actually, if you want to matriculate into medical school, the average there is closer to 511, 512, and certainly the number that you should be shooting for in order to be kind of broadly competitive under those statistics. Of course, everyone is different. Is above 505, 506, although, there absolutely are exceptions.
Yep.
So I always think that's a really valuable number to keep in mind, is like, okay, if I'm a perfectly average student, I will probably need to put in more than this amount of time because I'm shooting for a better score than the average.
Yeah, that's a good way
Aside
to
from
look at
that, aside from that, now we can start shifting this number in either direction. Do you have a really strong background in the sciences? It may be somewhat less. Were you like me and had almost no background in, 2 of the science sections? Like, maybe it'll be somewhat longer.
Yeah. Interesting. So about 290 hours on average that the AAMC quotes. That's a lot.
Yeah. And has been, I think, quite steadily rising over time. Obviously, you couldn't draw any causal relationships, but the average MCAT scores for matriculated medical students has also been rising over time.
Yeah.
As I'm sure, information circulates on what it really takes.
Yeah, I blame the podcast for that. Everyone's listening to the podcast going, oh, the MCAT's really important. I need to study more. I'm directly causing. No, it's the same thing that we see in medical school as well. The average step 1 score, as we're recording this, step 1 is still a scored exam, but it's moving past fail. Mm-hmm. When I was in school, the average step 1 score, I think, was like a 216. And now it's about a 230, which is a huge increase on the test. And so it comes from students understanding the importance of it, information being readily available through blogs and podcasts and social media, and students being exposed to what it actually takes earlier. When I went to medical school, I didn't really understand the importance of a step 1 score and how that affected your ability to match into a future specialty. And so I was kind of ignorant to the whole process, and therefore didn't take it as serious. And now students are taking it more serious. And there are more resources available. There are lots of companies starting all of the time around how to understand material better, how to learn the content better. And we see that with the MCAT as well, with both Blueprint's new live online course and their online course that came out last year, and other companies popping up left and right again for MCAT material. And so it's getting serious out there. And it's frustrating and stressful. What do you say to a student who's like, how do I keep up with this? And I'm not taking the test for another 2 years. The average then is going to be a 515, and this is going to be ridiculous.
Yeah. It's so stressful. I think particularly for students who, they come to this and they're like, I've wanted to be a doctor since I was 6 years old. So really, for so many people, this is their there is no plan B. They sometimes, they get to the MCAT and it's like, oh my God, it's this inscalable wall that, that to them just is like standing between them and happiness in their profession. It's like, it's really stressful.
It's a greased flagpole they have to climb.
Yeah. And I think particularly because then, they see so many of their friends somehow scaling it.
Yeah. And
they think oh, why can't I do that? And that's really stressful and can really kind of weigh on your mental health.
Yeah.
So I always say to students, in that situation, which is it's a intractable cliche, but it really is a marathon, not a sprint. So much of MCAT prep boils down to little decisions that you make every day over the span of months, rather than, a Herculean effort on any individual day.
Yeah, there's a really good book in the business world called, oh man, I'm forgetting it. The Compound Effect, I think. Yeah, the compound effect, where that's exactly what it is. It's like, just try to be 1% better every day. And unfortunately, students don't understand how compounding interest works. And maybe those finance pre-meds that we talked about earlier would know that. But
student loans compound, so they should.
Yeah. I think too many students try to go from 0 to 100 overnight. And they take their first full length, or they take a diagnostic and they get a 495 and they go, oh crap, like that's not good enough. I need a 520. That's what I'm shooting for. And they take their first kind of real full length and they get a 500 and they go, well, this is terrible. I'm not getting any better, any closer. I'm like, wait, you went from a 495 to a 500. That's a huge increase. Baby steps, baby steps. You got to get there. Oh, it's so frustrating.
Exactly. And, I think people, it's just like you said, people overestimate what they can do in a day and underestimate what they can do in 3 months.
Yeah. 1,000%. Yeah. I love that kind of quote. That's a very popular quote. Mm-hmm. I want to go back to you being kind of this pseudo international student. So spending time here in the States, being born and going to university in the UK, and then wanting to come to medical school in the States. Do you have dual citizenship, or are you a resident here? How does that work?
Yeah, so I have I actually have 4 passports.
So you're a spy. That's what you're saying.
It is. Well, I've looked, and actually to apply to MI6, you have to renounce all of your non-British passports. I have given it a non-trivial amount of consideration. So no, I was born in Cyprus and then lived in many, many countries growing up. Okay. And but settled in the US, from the age of about 9. And and actually people do ask me that. They're like, well, why do you want to be a doctor here? Mm-hmm. You've spoken to yourself about the particular and I think reasonably unique challenges that face the American medical system. People say to me, like, why don't you just want to be a doctor in the UK? Their health system is in so many ways more equitable or more functional. Yep. Why not do it there? I say to people, it's like, well, actually, I've lived here since I was 9. Although it doesn't sound like it, like America is my home. It's where my family is, and it's where I really see myself being long term. And I think, in a sense, although I think practicing as a physician in the US does come with some discrete trade-offs, ultimately, I think, particularly for international students who are considering, medical school in the US, particularly if you're doing an undergraduate degree here, that actually, if the US is the place where you see yourself long-term, actually, I think specializing as a physician here is really good for the country, because it is, I think it's only through the actions of people that are here that it will improve.
Interesting. So the fact that you did your undergraduate work in at an international school, a lot of students, especially students who are U.S. citizens, who born and raised here, and then go, I'm going to go have an adventure and go to the UK, go to Australia, go somewhere else and do my undergrad work. They don't realize that puts them at a disadvantage for applying to medical school, because medical schools want coursework here in the U.S. And so I'm interested to know, because you said you did some postbac work after kind of studying for the MCAT. Was that specifically for this kind of 90-hour requirement that a lot of schools have?
It was. So it's interesting. I decided to go to university in the UK. I assumed that it would be fine for medical school. That is probably not a decision I would make again.
Interesting.
I should have listened to your podcast. It turned the process of doing an international undergraduate degree, and then coming back to the US turned out to be vastly more work than I ever possibly imagined.
Yeah.
I had one exchange last year where there was a particular school that I was interested in, but they had at least 1 year of classes in the US requirement, which on balance seems to be the most common. There are a few medical schools which explicitly allow the UK in terms of coursework.
Nice.
I believe Stanford and Yale, I think, are both in that category.
Okay.
But there was one medical school that I really wanted to apply to, which had this 1 year of study in the US. And I sent the dean of the school a personal email saying, like, I know that I'm non-standard, like, but, you know, I have 2 degrees, one from, you know, and my master's degree was from the same school that he did his master's degree. You know, he came to the UK to do his master's degree.
Yeah.
So I sent him this email. I was like, and I hope, anyway, before going back to this medical school, and I said, you know, and I hope you weren't disadvantaged by the experience. No, please, I promise. I know, you know, I promise I took real classes. And it didn't work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I ended up, and this is why, you know, I've put in so much work to do Postbac classes in the US, and which is now actually, as of this coming summer, I will have fulfilled all of them.
Yeah, very interesting.
It is funny now, though, you know, taking chemistry, you know, like now because of COVID remotely, and you know, whatever, like, you know, whatever. You're in group classes, and people say, "Wow, you're really good at chemistry." I was like, "Yeah, weird."
Weird. Yeah. It's not like I have years and years and years under my belt, and the MCAT work. So I want to ask you specifically, because both your MCAT expertise and now having done the work in the UK and done classes here, do you understand why schools do that, or do you think it's just a ridiculous kind of standard they have set?
This walks, I think, a very delicate line because I think they're under. I mean, and obviously, of course, I mean, I want to preface and say it's very hard for me to speculate as to their underlying reasons. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of it is logistical limitations, where, you know, we know that your classes from the UK are almost certainly fine, but if we accept classes from the UK, we'll now be in this position where we have to, you know, select 24 countries in the world that we think are equivalent and invite accusations of discrimination.
Yeah.
And also then have to teach or, you know, train our admissions officers into interpreting the, you know, different and varying grading structures of all of these countries.
Yeah.
It's, you know, I understand the, you know, increase their proportion of applying students by 5 or 10%.
Yeah, they have. I think
plenty
of applicants as it is.
Yeah. On the other hand, I do hope that the policies change over the next few years. What a couple of US medical schools do, it's very uncommon. NYU is one of them. So I want to shout them out because I think they have a particularly forward-looking policy.
NYU's
they
awesome.
Say we don't. Yeah. And of course, the dean of admissions has been on the podcast
several times.
And and what they do is they've partnered with an external credential evaluating service, which effectively does the work of looking at the foreign transcripts and saying this is or is not equivalent to a US degree. Yeah. And I really like that approach because I think it is, if only symbolically, a commitment to what should be, I hope, most medical schools' underlying ideal, which is to accept bright, promising future physicians, kind of whatever their background may be. You know, why just because, you know, I was born in Afghanistan or I was born in Cyprus, should I be denied the opportunity to even apply to a promising medical school in the US?
Yeah. Makes sense. Well, Alex, I'm excited to have you for the next several weeks here on the MCAT podcast and pick your brain as we go through these passages and discrete sets and all this fun stuff as we continue on with our breakdown of full-length 1 from Blueprint to MCAT. So I'm excited to have you. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on your journey to medical school, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Yeah, see you then.